My name is Olivia Reyes, and I was 28 years old when I picked up my boyfriend's phone to check the time and saw my sister's Jade's name at the top of his messages, with a heart next to it that I had never put there. I want to tell you exactly what I was doing in the moment before I picked up that phone, because the before matters when the after is something you carry for the rest of your life. I was standing in Cole's kitchen in the early morning, barefoot on the tile floor, wearing his flannel shirt because mine was still in the truck from the night before, and I was making coffee the way I made it every Saturday morning when I stayed over, 2 scoops for him and 1.5 for me. The small domestic ritual of a woman who has made herself at home in someone else's space and believes that home is mutual. The sun was coming through the kitchen window the way it comes through every window in the San Joaquin Valley in October, that particular California gold that makes everything look like a painting of itself. And the farm was quiet, the way farms are quiet at 6 in the morning. Birds and wind, and the distant sound of the irrigation system doing its steady work. Cole's phone was on the counter beside the coffee maker. He was still asleep. I picked it up to check the time because my own phone was in the truck. The screen lit up, and there was my sister Jade's name with a red heart emoji that I had never seen in the year I had been with Cole, sitting at the top of his messages like it had always lived there. I set the coffee mugs down very carefully. I sat on the kitchen floor, and I started reading. Before I tell you what was in those messages, let me tell you about the town I grew up in, because place shapes people, and the place that shaped me and Jade and Cole and our whole broken situation was the kind of small that people who have never lived in it cannot fully understand. Ridgway, California, population just under 4,000, 30 minutes east of Fresno in the flat agricultural heart of the valley, where the horizon goes on so long you start to believe the earth is actually flat, and the air in summer smells like almond blossoms and dust, and the specific sweetness of irrigation water on dry soil. My family had been in Ridgway for 3 generations. My grandmother, Elena, had come from Mexico in 1971, with my grandfather, Marco, who worked the fields and eventually saved enough to buy a small plot of his own. And from that plot came everything. The house my mother grew up in, the house I grew up in, the particular Reyes family stubbornness about land and belonging that runs through all of us like a vein of something that does not bend. My mother, Rosa, ran the family's small produce operation, a roadside stand that sold directly to restaurants in Fresno and to the farmers market on Saturdays. My father left when I was 9, and Jade was 5, and he did it in the way of a man who decided to stop without deciding to explain, just less present until one day not present at all, and my mother folded it into her life without visible drama and kept working. That was how we were raised. You fold things in, and you keep working. It is a good way to raise children. It is not always a good way to process pain. Jade is 4 years younger than me, which made her 24 when all of this happened. I want to describe her accurately because she is the center of what happened, and accuracy matters more than anything else when you are telling a story about someone who hurt you, because inaccuracy is how you become the villain of your own account. Jade is beautiful. I say this plainly because it is true, and because pretending otherwise would be dishonest, and I'm done with anything that resembles dishonesty. She has the kind of face that people in Ridgway described as the Reyes luck: dark eyes, high cheekbones, the particular glow of someone who has never had to work hard to be noticed. She is also funny and quick and can make a room of strangers feel like old friends within 20 minutes, which is a genuine talent and one I have always admired and also always felt slightly flattened by, in the way a quieter person sometimes feels near a louder one. We were not enemies growing up. We were sisters who were different enough that we occupied different spaces without much collision. I was the one who managed the books for my mother's business at 16 and got a scholarship to Fresno State and came back to Ridgway because the land was home. Jade was the one who took up most of the oxygen in any room she entered and seemed not to notice the taking. The not noticing was the part I had always told myself was innocence. I revised that interpretation in Cole's kitchen on a Saturday morning in October, with the California gold coming through the window and his phone in my hand. I met Cole Dawson at the Ridgeway Farmers Market 14 months before the morning I found the messages. He had a stall 3 spots down from my mother's, and he was selling stone fruit and winter squash, and the particular variety of heirloom tomato that his family had been growing on their farm for 40 years. He was 32, tall, the specific weathered manner of someone who has spent most of his life around growing things, and has absorbed their patience. He came to our stall to buy rosemary on the 3rd Saturday and stayed to talk for 45 minutes, and my mother gave me a look from the other end of the table that I pretended not to see, because I was 27 and did not need my mother's looks, even when they were correct. He asked me to dinner that week. We went to the Italian place in Fresno that everyone in Ridgeway goes to for dates, because Ridgeway itself has 1 diner and 1 taqueria, and neither of them is quite right for a first date. We talked for 3 hours, and I drove home thinking, this one is different, with the specific cautious hope of someone who has been careful enough times to know that caution and hope are not the same thing, but can sometimes coexist. He was different. He was hardworking, honest, and present in the way that men who work the land are present, grounded, unhurried, seemingly incapable of the kind of careless drama that had characterized the men I had dated before. I was wrong about the careless part. I was right about the drama. The first sign came in 2 months, and I filed it in the place where I file things I am not ready to examine. We were at my mother's house for Sunday dinner, the usual gathering, my mother and Jade and my Aunt Rita, who was my mother's younger sister and who had lived 3 blocks away my entire life, a constant loud fixture of my childhood who cooked too much food and had opinions about everything and had been married twice and divorced twice and seemed to regard both marriages as things that had happened to her rather than choices she had made. Cole came with me that Sunday for the first time, and I watched him meet my family with the attentiveness I had been giving everything about him in those early months. He shook my mother's hand and said the right things. He helped carry dishes without being asked. He talked farming with my mother for 20 minutes with the genuine engagement of someone who speaks the same language. And then Jade came in from the backyard, where she had been on her phone, and she said, "Hi, Cole," in the particular voice she uses when she has already decided someone is worth talking to, warm and direct, and slightly too familiar for someone she was meeting for the first time. Cole said, "Hi, Jade," and smiled with his whole face in a way I had not seen him smile at anyone else at the table. I noted it. I folded it in. I told myself it was charm needing charm, and that some people just respond to each other's energy, and that it meant nothing, and I kept working. That was the first item. I did not write it down. I should have. Aunt Rita was a different kind of sign, and arrived sooner. She came to Cole's farm stand at the market the following Saturday, alone, which was unusual, because Rita did not come to the market alone. She came with my mother, or she sent Jade, or she called and asked me to bring her something. She did not browse on her own. But there she was, 3 spots down, leaning on Cole's table in the specific way Rita leaned on things when she was performing casualness, hip against the surface, head tilted, the full deployment of the Rita Reyes charm offensive that I had been watching my entire life, and that was effective enough that it produced 2 marriages and a rotation of male attention that my mother referred to as Rita's weather system. I watched from our stall. Cole laughed at something she said. Rita touched his arm. Cole did not step back. I folded that in, too. I told myself Rita was harmless. I told myself she did this with everyone. I told myself that I was being insecure, and that insecurity was not an attractive quality, and that I should focus on the fact that Cole came home with me that day, and not on the way he had laughed at whatever my aunt had said. Folding things in instead of examining them is a habit I come by honestly. My mother does it. Her mother did it before her. The Reyes women are very good at continuing to work and very slow to stop and look directly at what the work is covering. I was 37 items into covering before I picked up the phone, and the covering became impossible. The pattern with Cole defending Jade started in month 3.
I want to be specific about the incidents, because specificity is what separates a legitimate account from a complaint, and this is a legitimate account. The first incident was a dinner at my mother's house where Jade made a comment about my weight. Not cruelly, exactly. Jade's cruelties were never exactly cruel. They came wrapped in the language of concern or humor. She said, "Olivia, you have been stress eating again. I can always tell." She said it at the table in front of my mother and Cole and Rita, and she said it with the affectionate exasperation of an older observation being repeated for everyone's benefit. I felt the comment land in the specific place where comments like that land, and I said, "Jade, I would appreciate if you did not comment on my body." There was a brief silence. Cole said, "She's just kidding, Liv." Not to Jade, to me. He said it quietly, the way you say something to someone who is overreacting, and then he moved the conversation forward, and Jade gave me a small smile that was the smile of a woman who had just been defended without asking for it and knew exactly what that meant. I looked at Cole. He was already talking to my mother about the almond harvest. I said nothing. I folded it in. I kept working. That was the first time he took her side. It was not the last. It was not even close to the last, but it was the one I remember most clearly, because it was the moment I understood, even if I did not let myself understand it fully, that something was already wrong. The incidents with Rita were different quality but consistent in pattern. Rita flirted with Cole openly, not subtly, not with the plausible deniability of accidental contact or ambiguous language, but with the direct, practiced flirtation of a woman who has been doing it long enough to have developed a technique. She would find reasons to be at the farm. She would bring food, tamales or menudo, or the specific pan dulce from the bakery in Fresno that she knew Cole liked because she had asked him what he liked in the second week after meeting him. She would text him. I knew this because I saw his phone light up with her name twice before the morning I read the messages, and each time I saw it, I said, "Rita texted you," and he said, "Yeah, she had a question about the irrigation schedule," or "Yeah, she wanted to know if we needed anything from town," and each answer was plausible, and each answer was also a door I could not fully open because the plausibility was doing exactly the work it was designed to do. When I raised Rita directly with Cole in month 5 and said, "I'm uncomfortable with how much she contacts you," he said, "Olivia, she's your aunt." He said it with the specific tone of a man who is saying you are being unreasonable without saying the words. He said, "She's just being friendly. She's lonely since the second divorce." I said, "I know she's lonely." I said, "That is not my concern. My concern is the frequency." He said, "I'm not going to be rude to your family." He said it like that. It did not settle anything. It opened the drawer where I was storing everything and added another item.
Month 6 was the first time Cole sent me back. I want to explain what I mean by sent me back because it is the part of the story that took me the longest to name clearly. We had an argument, a real one, about his refusal to set any boundary with Rita. I had come to him with something specific. Rita had shown up at his farm unannounced on a Tuesday while I was at work and had stayed for 2 hours, and when I found out from his farmhand Marcus, who mentioned it as casually as information rather than gossip, I felt the specific cold recognition of someone who is being kept out of a room. I confronted Cole. He said Rita had just stopped by. I said, "She stops by a lot." He said she is checking on the place. I said, "Cole, she has no reason to check on your farm. She is my aunt, and you are my boyfriend, and the dynamic between the two of you makes me uncomfortable, and I need you to take that seriously." He looked at me with the expression he used when he had decided I was being irrational, not unkind, just the closed expression of a man who has reached the edge of what he is going to engage with. He said, "Olivia, maybe you should talk to Rita about this. Maybe the two of you need to work it out." He said it as if I were the problem between myself and my aunt. He said it as if Rita's behavior was my relationship problem to manage. And then, when the argument escalated because I pushed back, he said, "Maybe you should go home tonight." He said it quietly. And I went. I drove to my mother's house, where Rita was sitting at the kitchen table, and I understood, only partially then and more fully later, that Cole had sent me directly to the person he was defending. I want to tell you about the first time I noticed something specific about the way Cole held his phone when Jade was mentioned. This is a small observation, and it is the kind of observation that requires a certain quality of attention to make, the attention of a woman who has been watching carefully for months without letting herself name what she is watching for. We were driving back from Fresno in November, 7 months in, and I mentioned that Jade was coming home for Thanksgiving from Fresno, where she had been living with friends for a few months. The moment I said Jade's name, Cole's posture changed. Not dramatically, he did not flinch or react visibly, but there was a quality of stillness that arrived in him when I said her name, the specific stillness of someone whose attention has just sharpened in a direction they do not want observed. He said, "Oh yeah? Cool." And then he said, "How long is she staying?" And the question was casual, but there were two of them, the "Oh yeah, cool" and the "How long is she staying?" And two questions about one piece of information is not casual. It is interest wearing the costume of casualness. I stored it. I told myself I was reading things into his posture that were not there. I told myself that Jade was my sister and that men could find a woman attractive without acting on it, and that attraction was not the same as action, and that I was constructing a problem from materials that did not necessarily constitute a problem. I was a very good folder. I was the best folder I had ever been in the months before I stopped folding and started reading. Jade came home for Thanksgiving, and the Thanksgiving dinner was the clearest thing I had seen in 7 months, and I still did not let myself see it completely. There were 8 of us at my mother's table: my mother, Jade, Rita, me, Cole, my cousin Marisol and her husband, and my grandmother Elena, who was 81 and sharp as field wire, and who watched everything at that table from the end of it with the specific attention of a woman who has seen enough of human behavior to have stopped being surprised by any of it. Cole sat next to Jade, not by my arrangement, by the arrangement that had happened while I was in the kitchen helping my mother with the tamales, and when I came out they were already seated, and Jade was talking and Cole was listening with the focused quality of attention I recognized, because it was the quality he had given me on our first date, the attention that makes you feel like the most interesting thing in the room. I sat across from them. I watched. Jade told a story about something that had happened at her job in Fresno, and Cole laughed twice, genuinely, the specific, unguarded laugh of someone who is enjoying themselves without self-consciousness. Rita watched Cole from the other end of the table with the expression of a woman who is calculating something. My grandmother Elena watched me watching all of them. At the end of the dinner, while everyone was clearing plates, my grandmother found me in the kitchen and put her hand on my arm and said, quietly, in Spanish, "Keep your eyes open, mija." I said, "I know, Grandma." She said, "No." She said, "I mean all the way open." I thought about that on the drive home with Cole, who was quieter than usual, and I thought about Jade's laugh and the way he had listened, and I began, very slowly, to let myself see what I had been folding in for 7 months. The texts I found in October were 8 months after Thanksgiving, 8 months during which the pattern continued and deepened, and I continued to fold things in with decreasing conviction. I want to tell you what was in those texts because the content is the evidence, and evidence should not be softened. The conversation between Cole and Jade went back 11 months. 11 months! We had been together 14 months, which meant the texting had started 3 months in the earliest weeks when everything was still new and I was still learning the shape of him, and he was apparently already texting my sister. The texts were not explicitly sexual. I want to be precise about this, because the absence of explicit content was the thing Cole later used to defend himself. They were not explicit. They were something more insidious than explicit, which was intimate. They were the texts of two people who have established between themselves a private world that the third person in the triangle is not part of. Inside jokes I had never heard. References to conversations I had not been in.
Cole saying, "Your sister is intense today," after an argument he and I had, not with exasperation, but with the conspiratorial ease of someone talking to an ally. Jade saying, "I know how to handle her, don't worry." I sat on the kitchen floor of Cole's farmhouse, and I read 11 months of my sister and my boyfriend handling me together, and I felt the specific cold of a woman who had just understood the full shape of something she had been half seeing for almost a year.
I did not wake up Cole. This is the part people find most surprising when I tell it. I sat on his kitchen floor for 45 minutes, and I read every text, and I made a decision about how to proceed, and the decision was not confrontation in that kitchen on that Saturday morning. The decision was information. I needed more of it before I moved. I had read enough mystery novels and watched enough of my grandmother's careful navigation of difficult family situations to understand that the person who reveals what they know too early loses the advantage of knowing it. I had Cole's phone in my hand. I took screenshots of the most significant texts, forwarded them to my own number from his phone, deleted the forwarding evidence from his sent messages the way I had seen it done in a crime documentary once, and then I put his phone back exactly where I had found it. I finished making the coffee. I brought it to the bedroom. I set his mug on the nightstand, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at him sleeping in the morning light, and I thought, I know what you are. And I thought, I need to know the rest of it before you know that I know. He woke up and said, "Morning." I said, "Morning." He said, "Coffee smells good." I said, "Yes, it does." We drank it together in bed the way we always did on Saturday mornings, and he talked about the harvest, and I listened, and I was the best version of calm I have ever been in my life, which is saying something because I have always been calm, but this calm was built on top of something entirely different, and it held. The Rita investigation took 3 weeks. I call it an investigation because that is what it was: methodical, specific, information-driven. I had the texts between Cole and Jade. What I did not yet have was the full picture of what had been happening with Rita, who was a different character in the story, and whose relationship with Cole had a different texture than Jade's, but whose betrayal was, in its own way, equally complete. Rita was not subtle, and so the evidence of Rita was less difficult to assemble. I started with Marcus, Cole's handman, who had mentioned Rita's Tuesday visit without understanding he was giving me information. I asked Marcus carefully and casually over the course of 3 conversations that were about other things how often Rita came by the farm. He said, pretty regularly. I said, what does regularly mean? He said, maybe once a week, sometimes twice. I said, since when? He scratched the back of his neck and said, since around springtime, I think. Springtime was month 4. I had been raising my concerns about Rita since month 5. Cole had been managing Rita's visits to his farm since month 4, while telling me she was just being friendly. I thanked Marcus. I added it to the list I was keeping in my phone notes, dated, specific, the beginning of my own record. I did not yet have a binder. What I had was a notes app and a growing sense of clarity that arrived with each new item, the way clarity always arrives when you stop folding things in and start looking at them directly. I drove to Fresno on a Thursday, and I told no one where I was going, not my mother, not Jade, not Cole. I went to the phone carrier store and I asked, with the calm specificity of a woman who had prepared for this conversation, whether there was a way to access the full record of texts from a shared account. Cole and I were not on a shared account, but my name was the primary account holder on my own plan, and I understood enough about how these things worked to know that what I could access was my own records. What I wanted was something else, and the something else was not available through the carrier, which I had expected but needed to confirm. What I did instead was go to the coffee shop across from the carrier store, and I sat down and I opened my phone and I read the screenshots I had taken from Cole's phone. Again, this time not from the floor of his kitchen with the shock still fresh, but with the distance of 2 weeks and the clarity that distance produces. I made a list, not of grievances, of facts.
Fact 1. Cole had been in regular text contact with my sister Jade since month 3 of our relationship. Fact 2. The texts were intimate in register and conspiratorial in content, specifically referencing me as a subject they discussed together. Fact 3. Cole had been managing regular visits from Rita to his farm since month 4, while minimizing the frequency to me. Fact 4. On at least 6 documented occasions, Cole had taken Jade's or Rita's side in disagreements involving me without adequate basis for that position. Fact 5. On one occasion, Cole had sent me during an argument directly to the home where Rita was present. I looked at my list. I thought, this is the full shape. And then I thought, I need one more thing before I move. The one more thing I needed was Jane in person, and I got her on a Sunday 2 weeks later when she came back to Ridgeway for the weekend. I did not tell her what I knew. I want to be clear about that, because the temptation to confront immediately was real, and I did not follow it because immediate confrontation would have given her the chance to call Cole and coordinate their story, and I was not going to give either of them that chance. What I did instead was invite her to lunch at the Taqueria, just the two of us, the way we had done occasionally before any of this happened, the occasional gesture of sister maintenance that neither of us pursued with particular enthusiasm, but that we both recognized as necessary for the family ecosystem. She came in bright and easy the way she always came into rooms, and she ordered her usual, and she talked about Fresno, her job, and a man she had been seeing, and I listened with the particular quality of attention I had developed over the past month, not the attention of someone absorbing information, but the attention of someone looking for confirmation. I watched her mention Cole's name twice, casually, as if he were a shared family reference, and not my boyfriend. I watched her check her phone once, and the way she checked it, briefly, the screen angle, the quick replacement of it face down on the table, told me she had seen something she did not want me to see. I said, "Cole says hi, by the way." She said, "Oh yeah? Tell him hi back." She said it without hesitation, without a flicker, the practiced ease of someone who has been performing this conversation for 11 months. I told James my plan on a Monday. Not James from this story. James is my cousin Marisol's husband. I told my friend Priya, who had been my closest friend since Fresno State, and who was the person I told when something real was happening, because Priya had the specific quality of not flinching at the truth that I needed in the people I trusted. She listened to everything, the texts, the farm visits, the defending, the sending back. When she finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to expose all 3 of them." She said, "How?" I said, "Publicly, completely, with documentation, so that no one in Ridgeway has any question about what happened." She said, "And then?" I said, "And then I am leaving." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Leaving Ridgeway?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Where?" I said, "I have been thinking about that." She said, "Olivia, this is a lot." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you sure about the public part?" I said, "I have been watching these 3 people manage my perception of reality for almost a year. My sister told my boyfriend how to handle me. My aunt visited his farm twice a week while he told me she was just being friendly. He sent me home to be humiliated by the people he was privately loyal to." I said, "Yes, I am sure about the public part." She said, "Okay." She said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to help me document the rest and to be there when I do it." She said, "I will be there." That was the conversation that moved everything from the thinking stage to the doing stage. I spent the following 2 weeks doing 3 things simultaneously. I was documenting, I was planning, and I was maintaining the surface of my life with Cole and my family exactly as it had been, which was the most demanding of the 3, and also the most important. I went to Cole's farm on Wednesday evenings the way I always had. I had Sunday dinner at my mother's house the way I always had. I was present and warm and gave nothing away, because giving something away would have collapsed the timeline I needed. The documentation grew.
I had the screenshots from Cole's phone. I had Marcus's account of the farm visits. I had my own dated log of every incident I could recall with specificity, the comments Jade had made, the arguments Cole had refused to take my side in, the times Rita had been present at moments that felt orchestrated. I compiled it, not in a physical binder, but in a folder on my laptop that I backed up to the cloud and to Priya's email, because I had learned enough from reading about these situations to know that physical evidence in a shared space is vulnerable. The planning was the harder part. I had grown up in Ridgeway. My mother was in Ridgeway. My grandmother was in Ridgeway. My family's produce business was in Ridgeway. Leaving was not a simple decision, and I did not make it simply. I had been offered a position 6 months earlier by an agricultural consulting firm in Sacramento, a job that would have moved me out of the valley and that I had turned down because I was building something with Cole, and it didn't feel like the right time. I called the firm. I asked if the position was still available or if something similar might be. They said, "We were hoping you would change your mind."
The Sacramento position was confirmed in writing on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks before I moved. I accepted it, signed the offer letter, arranged a temporary housing situation through the firm's relocation service, and told no one in Ridgeway. Not my mother, not Jade, not Cole. I told Priya and my grandmother. My grandmother was the one I told in person, and the conversation with her was the one that made everything real in a way the offer letter had not. I drove to her house on a Tuesday evening, and she was sitting on her porch the way she sat on her porch every evening, watching the end of the day. I sat beside her. I told her what I had found, what I had documented, what I was planning. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I told you to open your eyes all the way." I said, "I know, Grandma." She said, "I saw it at Thanksgiving." I said, "What did you see?" She said, "I saw your man listening to your sister the way he should have been listening to you." She said, "And I saw your aunt watching your man the way she has always watched things that are not hers." She said, "Some people cannot stand to see you have something they do not." I said, "I know." She said, "You are leaving." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She said it without ceremony, without drama, the flat, decisive good of a woman who has spent 81 years watching the valley and knows exactly what things need to end and which ones need to leave in order to end properly. She took my hand and held it for a moment. She said, "Come back when it is quiet." I said, "I will." I chose the farmer's market. I want to tell you why I chose the farmer's market, and not a private confrontation or a series of phone calls or any of the quieter options that were available to me. I chose it because the farmer's market was where I had met Cole, which meant it was the beginning of the story, and ending it there had a completeness that mattered to me. I chose it because every person in Ridgeway who needed to know what had happened would be there. My mother would be there. Rita would be there. People who knew my family and Cole's family and who had watched us together for a year would be there. I was not choosing the market to cause a scene. I was choosing it because what had been done to me had been done quietly, in the spaces between what I could see, and I believed that the exposure of it should happen in the most visible space available. Priya agreed. She drove from Fresno the night before and stayed at my apartment, and we went over the plan. I had printed the screenshots, the 11 months of texts between Cole and Jade, in the most relevant excerpts. I had written a summary, brief and factual, of the farm visits, the defending pattern, the sending back. I had copies for Cole, for Jade, for Rita, and a digital version sent to Priya's phone as backup. I had my resignation from the life I had been living in Ridgeway organized and ready, and the truck packed with the things that mattered, and the new Sacramento address confirmed, and the new chapter prepared in every practical detail. The farmer's market opened at 7. I arrived at 6:45. Cole was setting up his stall when I arrived. He looked up and smiled the easy smile of a man who has no idea what the next 20 minutes contain. He said, "You are early." I said, "I know." I said, "I need to talk to you before the market opens." He said, "Everything okay?" I said, "No." I said it flatly, without warmth, and he registered the flatness the way you register a change in weather, a slight stiffening of attention.
I pulled out the printed screenshots. I set them on his table between the stone fruit and the heirloom tomatoes. I said, "I found these on your phone 6 weeks ago." He looked down. I watched him recognize them. I watched his face go through 4 expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, calculation, and then the specific quality of a man who is assembling a defense before he fully understands the charge. He said, "Olivia." I said, "I am not here for an explanation." I said, "I am here so you know that I know completely, and that I am leaving completely, and that everyone at this market today is going to know why." He said, "Wait." He said, "This is not what it looks like." I said, "Cole, I read 11 months of texts. I know what it looks like. I know what it is." He said, "We were just talking." I looked at him. I said, "You told my sister I was intense, and she told you she knew how to handle me." I said, "That is not just talking. That is the 2 of you managing me together." He had no answer for that. I picked up my copies of the printout. I said, "I am going to see Jade now."
Jade was at my mother's stall 3 spots down. She was helping my mother set up the display, arranging the produce with the careless competence of someone who has done it 1,000 times and could do it in her sleep. She saw me coming and smiled the automatic smile, and then saw something in my face that made the smile go careful. I said, "Jade, I need you to read something." I handed her the printed excerpts. She looked at the first page. I watched her face. She did not go through 4 expressions the way Cole had. She went through 2. Recognition, and then the specific quality of stillness that was not guilt exactly, but was the particular stillness of someone who has been caught in something they believed was invisible. She said, "Where did you get these?" I said, "From Cole's phone." She said, "Olivia." I said, "I know how to handle her." I said it back to her, her own words from the text, quietly, without accusation, just returning them to her. She started to say something. I said, "I am not angry at you in the way you might expect." I said, "I am clear about you." I said, "I know what you did and I know why you did it, and I am done with both the doing and the why." She said, "It was not like that." I said, 11 months, Jade." I said, "You were talking to my boyfriend about me for 11 months. I said, "There is nothing you can tell me it was like." My mother, who had been listening from the other side of the stall, set down the basket she was holding and looked at Jade with an expression I had never seen my mother use on Jade before. It was the expression of a woman who has just understood something she wishes she had understood sooner. Rita was at her usual spot near the entrance of the market with a coffee in one hand and her phone in the other. She saw me coming. I think she had already heard something. The market was small enough that a conversation 3 stalls down could travel in 3 minutes, and her posture when she saw me had the quality of someone who is bracing. I handed her the single page I had prepared specifically for her, the summary of the farm visits documented by Marcus, the frequency, the dates, the duration, the pattern. She looked at it. She said, "Olivia, I can explain." I said, "Marcus kept pretty good records." I said, "Twice a week for 6 months while Cole told me you were just being friendly." She said, "I was just—" I said, "Rita." I said her name the way my grandmother said things, flat and complete, the single word that closes a door. I said, "You are my mother's sister. You have known me my whole life." I said, "Whatever you thought you were doing at that farm, you knew it was wrong because you did it while I was at work, and you did it while he was telling me it was not happening." She looked away. She said, "I was lonely." I said, "I know you were." I said, "Being lonely does not make it okay." She did not have anything else to say. I looked at her for a moment, this woman who had been at every birthday and every holiday and every difficult moment of my childhood, and I felt something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but was the specific feeling of a thing being over that you had assumed was permanent. I said, "Take care of yourself, Rita," and I walked away. The market had been open for 30 minutes by the time I finished with Rita. People had seen the conversations. Not all of them, not the words, but the visible quality of 3 confrontations in 30 minutes carries information in a small town without anyone needing to hear the specific content. I could feel the market recalibrating around me as I walked back toward the entrance, the particular subtle shift of a community that is in the process of updating its understanding of a situation it thought it already knew. My mother found me near the entrance. She had left Jade at the stall. She took my arm and walked me to the parking lot, and she said, "Tell me what happened." I told her. Not everything, not every detail, but the shape of it. The texts, the farm visits, the defending, the sending back, the year of being managed by the person she was with and the people she was supposed to be protected by. My mother is a woman who folds things in, I come by it honestly, but she was not folding this. She listened, and her face did the thing it does when she has received information that rearranges something she had organized differently. She said, "I did not know." I said, "I know you did not." She said, "I am sorry." I said, "Mom, it is not yours to apologize for." She said, "Jade is my child, and what she did is something I have to account for as her mother." I said, "Yes." I said, "But that is between you and her. What is between you and me is what has always been between us, and that is not changed." She said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Sacramento." I said, "I took the job." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. She said, "Come back when you are ready." I said, "I will, Mom." I hugged her. I meant it completely. Cole came to my apartment that afternoon. I had expected this, which is why the truck was already packed and the keys were on the counter and the apartment was in the condition I wanted to leave it in. He knocked. I opened the door. He looked at the packed boxes visible behind me and understood immediately that this was not a conversation about whether we could work it out. He said, "Olivia, please." I said, "Come in." I let him come in because he deserved to say what he was going to say, and I deserved to hear it in the condition of someone who had already decided and therefore was not at risk of being moved by it. He said, "I never did anything with Jade." I said, "I know that." He said, "It was just texting." I said, "Cole, do you understand what the texts were about?" He was quiet. I said, "The texts were about me. You and my sister talked about me. You coordinated around me. You used what she told you about how to manage me, and she used what you told her about our arguments to position herself as the reasonable one." I said, "You did not have to sleep with her to betray me." He looked at the floor. He said, "I got caught up." I said, "In what?" He said, "I don't know. She was easy to talk to." I said, "I was available to talk to." I said, "I was right here." He said, "You are always so—" He stopped. I said, "Say it." He said, "Intense." I said, "I know." I said, "Jade told you that and you believed it instead of asking yourself why I was intense." He had nothing. I said, "I am leaving today." He said, "Can we—" I said, "No." I said, "Take care of your farm, Cole. It is a good farm." I closed the door. I drove out of Ridgeway on a Saturday afternoon in November with the truck packed and the sun going down behind me in the rearview mirror, the San Joaquin Valley going gold in the way it always went gold at the end of the day, the particular California light that had been the light of my entire life until that moment. I had lived in Ridgeway for 28 years. I had left once for Fresno State and come back because the land was home, and because home meant something I had believed was permanent and rooted, the way the almond trees along the highway were rooted, deep and old and not going anywhere. I had been wrong that home was those things. I had been right that it was important. What I understood driving out of it, with the documentary evidence of a year of betrayal in a folder on the seat beside me, was that home is not the place that has always contained you. Home is the place that you build around the people who are honest with you and loyal to you, and who, when you are not in the room, speak of you the way they speak to you. I had not had that in Ridgeway. I had had its performance. I was driving toward the real thing. I did not know yet exactly what it looked like, but I knew it was not behind me, and I knew it was in front of me, and I knew that the woman driving the truck was someone I trusted, finally and completely, in a way I had not trusted myself for a year. The clear-eyed, certain version of Olivia Reyes, who had stopped folding things in and started looking at them directly, and had liked what she found when she looked. Sacramento was different from Ridgeway in every visible way and some invisible ones that I had not anticipated. The city was not small. The horizon was not endless in the flat agricultural way of the valley. People did not know my grandmother or my mother or my history, and that anonymity, which I had expected to be lonely, was instead the specific relief of being allowed to be exactly who I was in this moment, without the weight of who everyone had decided I had always been. I started the job on a Monday. The firm was good, organized, the kind of workplace that functions with the clear procedural logic I have always found genuinely comforting, because procedures do not have agendas, and logic does not take sides. My colleagues were professional and curious, and none of them had ever met Jade or Rita or Cole, and none of them knew anything about me except what I told them, and what I told them was the true version, not the managed one. I found an apartment in Midtown, second floor, a bedroom and a kitchen with a window that looked out over a courtyard with a lemon tree in it that someone had planted, and that bore fruit with the specific abundance of something that had been well cared for over a long time. I sat at the kitchen window on my first Sunday morning and drank coffee and listened to the city and thought about Ridgeway, not with grief exactly, but with the particular clarity of distance, and I thought, I am okay, not performing okay, actually okay. It was the first time I had thought that and meant it completely since before the morning I sat on Cole's kitchen floor. My mother called every Sunday. She had always called every Sunday, but the calls were different now, freed from the performance of normal that had been required when I was in Ridgeway managing the appearance of a life that was quietly being undermined. She told me things she told me honestly, and I told her things honestly, and the calls became something they had not quite been when I was there, genuinely connecting rather than maintaining. She told me about Jade, not to guilt me or redirect me, but because she was my mother and she was honest with me. She said Jade had been quiet since the market. She said Jade had asked about me once, and she had told her that I was building something new, and that the rest was between Jade and me. She said she knows what she did. I said, does she understand why it was wrong? She was quiet for a moment. She said, I think she is working on that. I said, okay. I said, I am not closing that door permanently. I said, but I am not opening it from this side. She said, that is fair. She said, Olivia, can I tell you something I should have told you before any of this? I said, yes. She said, I always knew Jade was jealous of you. She said, not because she was a bad person, but because you built things and she wanted things, and she never fully understood the difference. She said, I should have done something about that earlier. I said, Mom, Jade is 24. She made her own choices. She said, yes, but I am her mother and I watched the seeds of it and did not tend them properly. I said, you are tending now. She said, I am trying. I said, that is enough. That is always enough. Priya came to Sacramento in December, a month after I moved, and we had the dinner I had been promising her since the market. She sat across from me at a restaurant in Midtown and she said, how does it feel? I said, it feels like the first time I'm in a room where I'm not managing anything. She said, that's a big thing. I said, I know. She said, do you miss him? I said, I miss the version of him I thought he was. I said, the real version I do not miss, because the real version was managing me with my sister and defending my aunt and sending me back to be humiliated by people he was privately loyal to. She said, that's a clear-eyed answer. I said, I've been practicing clear-eyed. She said, it suits you. We talked for 3 hours, and the conversation moved through everything. What happened, what I had built in the weeks since, what Sacramento was like, what the job was like, where I wanted to be in a year. And at the end of the dinner, she said, I want to ask you something. I said, okay.
She said, "Are you angry?" I thought about that. I said, "Not the way I was at the market." I said, "At the market, I was angry in the specific way you are angry when the thing you have been folding in for a year is finally visible and you are finally looking at it directly." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I am something else." She said, "What?" I said, "I think the word is clear." She said, "Clear is good." I said, "Clear is better than okay." Clear is the thing that comes after you have done the work of understanding something completely, and it's the best thing available after that kind of year. Cole texted me in January, 2 months after I left. I had not blocked his number because blocking felt like a performance of anger I was not trying to sustain, and also because I had wanted to see if he would. He texted one message. "I've been thinking about what you said at the apartment, about how I should have asked why you were intense instead of just accepting Jade's version." I read it 3 times, not because I was considering a response, but because the text represented something I wanted to note, the specific quality of a person arriving at an understanding they were not capable of at the time it would have mattered. I did not reply. I set the phone down and I looked out the window at the lemon tree in the courtyard, which had produced 3 lemons since I moved in and was working on a 4th, and I thought about Cole on his farm in the October mornings with the California gold coming through, and I thought about the person I had been when I met him, cautious and hoping, and I thought about the person I was now, clear and building, and I thought that the distance between those 2 people was the distance between folding things in and looking at them directly, and that the distance was worth every difficult mile. I added a note to the folder on my laptop. Final item. Cole text January. Arrived at understanding late. No response sent. Folder closed. I closed the folder. I made coffee. I went to work.
The thing about small towns is that information travels, and the information about what had happened at the Ridgeway Farmers Market in November had traveled in the specific, thorough way of small town information that involves enough witnesses to make revision impossible. Tess, who had been a mutual friend in the way that all friends are mutual in a town of 4,000, called me in February and said, "People are asking about you." I said, "What kind of asking?" She said, "The kind where they already know something happened and they want to fill in the details." She said, "Cole is not doing great." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "I think he understood the full weight of it after you left." I said, "What about Jade?" She said, "Jade is back in Fresno." She said, "I think your mom had some words with her." I said, "I expected that." She said, "And Rita?" I said, "What about Rita?" Tess paused and then said, "Rita told someone at the salon that you had been paranoid and that nothing happened." I said, "Okay." I said, "Tess, Marcus has records of the farm visits and I have the texts, and my grandmother saw what she saw at Thanksgiving." I said, "Rita can say what she wants to say. The documentation says something different." Tess said, "I know." She said, "I just thought you should know she was spinning it." I said, "Let her spin." I said, "I am in Sacramento, and I have a job I like, and a lemon tree outside my window, and I am not thinking about Rita's spinning." She laughed. She said, "That is the best thing you have ever said." I said, "It is the truest thing." My grandmother Elena came to visit me in March. She had not left Ridgeway in 4 years, not since her hip surgery, and the fact of her getting on a bus to Sacramento for a 4-day visit was communicated to me by my mother with the specific emphasis of a woman who understands that this is information requiring a response. I picked Grandma up at the Sacramento bus station on a Friday evening, and she walked off the bus in her church cardigan with a tote bag full of tamales she had made the day before, and she looked around the station and said, "Not as ugly as I expected." I said, "The city grows on you." She said, "Show me the apartment." I showed her the apartment. She inspected it with the thoroughness of a woman who has been maintaining a household for 60 years and has opinions on the organization of space. She approved of the kitchen. She approved of the lemon tree. She sat at my window with her coffee the next morning, and she said, "You are better." I said, "Yes." She said, "You look like yourself." I said, "I feel like myself." She said, "You stopped carrying things that were not yours to carry." I said, "I did." She said, "That is the whole job, mija."
She said people will put things on you, always, because some people travel lighter by loading others. The job is knowing which things are yours and which are theirs, and putting the ones that are theirs back down. I said, I am learning that. She said, you are past learning, you are doing. I said, I had a good teacher. She said, you had a hard year. Those are the same thing sometimes. We sat at the window with the lemon tree and drank our coffee and said nothing else for a while. It was the best morning I had had in a long time. Jade called me in April, 5 months after the market. I had been waiting to see if she would, not because I needed her to in order to be okay, I was okay, but because the call or the absence of it would tell me something specific about who she was underneath the version of herself that had been talking to my boyfriend for 11 months. She called on a Tuesday evening. I answered. She said, Olivia? I said, Jade? She said, I have been trying to figure out what to say to you for 5 months. I said, okay. She said, I do not have a version of this that makes it okay. I said, no. She said, I told myself it was harmless. I said, I know. She said, I told myself I wasn't doing anything, just talking to him. She said that last part quietly, the specific quality of someone saying something true that they've been working up to for 5 months. I said, yes. She said, I don't know why I do that. I said, I think you do know, Jade. I said, I think you have always known when you were doing it, and the not knowing is something you tell yourself so you don't have to account for the doing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I am jealous of you. She said it the way my grandmother said things, flat and complete. I said, I know. She said, I have always been jealous of you. I said, I know that too. She said, what do I do with that? I said, that is your question to answer, not mine. I said, I am not going to tell you how to do the work that is yours to do. But I will say this, the jealousy is yours, and it is real, and it is doing damage, and until you name it completely, you are going to keep doing things like this. She said, I know. She said, I am sorry, Olivia. I said, I hear that. I said, I am not ready for more than that right now. She said, okay. She said, I will wait. The Sacramento job grew into something better than I had anticipated. I had taken it as an exit from Ridgeway rather than an entrance into something specific, and what it turned out to be was both, which is the particular surprise of a decision made in urgency that turns out to also be the right decision for reasons you had not yet understood when you made it. The work was good, substantive agricultural consulting for farms and cooperatives across the Central Valley, the kind of work that used everything I had learned growing up in Ridgeway and at Fresno State, and in the years I managed my mother's produce business books. I was good at it in the specific way you are good at things that align with what you actually are, rather than what you have been performing. My colleagues respected me. My supervisor said, after the first quarterly review, that I had a particular quality of seeing the full picture of a situation that was rare and valuable. I thought about that. I thought about the year of folding things in, and the month of assembling the evidence, and the morning at the market, and the drive out of Ridgeway, and I thought, yes, I know how to see the full picture. I learned it the hard way, but I learned it completely, and it turns out that the capacity developed in assembling the truth about a betrayal is the same capacity required for understanding the full complexity of an agricultural financial situation. Everything is connected. The useful things always are.
I went back to Ridgeway in June, 7 months after I left. Not because I had resolved everything, because my grandmother's 82nd birthday required my presence, and my grandmother's requirements were the ones I honored without negotiation. I drove down on a Friday afternoon, the same highway in reverse, the valley opening up around me with the summer heat and the flat horizon and the particular smell of irrigation water and almond blossoms that would always mean home regardless of where I lived. My mother's house was full of people, the Reyes family gathering that happened around every significant occasion, cousins and aunts and uncles and neighbors, and the church women who had known my grandmother since before my mother was born. I walked in and was absorbed immediately into the warmth of it, the specific, loud, warm embrace of a family that, despite everything, was mine, and was present, and was real. Jade was there. We saw each other across the kitchen. Neither of us spoke immediately. Then she came to me and said, "Hi." I said, "Hi." She said, "You look really good." I said, "I am really good." She said, "I know." She said it with the specific quality of someone who has been doing the work she said she was going to do. I did not test it. I did not interrogate it. I said, "Happy birthday to Grandma from both of us." She said, "Yes," and that was enough for that day. Not forgiveness exactly, not restoration of what had been, but the small beginning of something that might, over a long time and with real effort on both sides, become something honest. My grandmother caught my eye from across the room. She nodded once. I nodded back. I did not see Cole in Ridgeway that weekend. I had not expected to and had not arranged to, and when Tess mentioned that he had asked about me, I said, "Tell him I am well and leave it at that." What I felt about Cole at that point was something I had been trying to name accurately since I left, because accuracy matters, and the inaccurate version, which was simple anger or simple hurt, was not what I actually had. What I had was something more complicated, the understanding that Cole was not a villain in the way that story wants its betrayers to be villains, deliberate and calculated and aware of the full damage. He was a man who had found my sister easy to talk to and had not examined why he was talking to her about me, had not asked himself what the conversations were doing to his relationship with me, had prioritized his own comfort in each small decision without adding up what the small decisions amounted to across 11 months. He was flawed in the specific way of people who do not want to cause harm, but are also not willing to examine the ways in which they might be causing it. I had loved that man, not the version of him I had constructed from the market and the Saturday mornings and the careful attentiveness of the early months, the real version. And the real version had been unable to choose me when the choice was uncomfortable. That was the truth of it, and I had named it completely, and naming it completely meant I could set it down. I had set it down in January when I did not reply to his text. I had confirmed the setting down in June when I did not seek him out. It was done, completely done, and done completely was the only way to do it. There is something I want to tell you about jealousy inside a family, because it is the part of this story that is most common and least discussed, and I think the silence around it does a specific kind of damage. Jealousy between siblings is real, and it is not a moral failure to feel it. What is a moral failure is to act on it in ways that harm the person you are jealous of while telling yourself you are not doing anything. Jade felt what she felt. That was hers to feel. What she chose to do with what she felt, the 11 months of talking to my boyfriend about me in ways that made me smaller in his eyes, was a choice. And the distance between feeling something and choosing to act on it in that particular way is exactly the distance that accountability needs to live in. Rita was different. Rita was operating from the specific need of a woman who had spent her adult life seeking validation through male attention, and who had looked at Cole and seen something she wanted and pursued it without asking whether pursuing it was a betrayal of me, her niece, who had trusted her with proximity to my life. I do not know if Rita ever named that to herself. I know she told someone at the salon I was paranoid. I know the distance between paranoid and documented is the distance between her version and mine. I know which one has the evidence, and I know that the exposure of what happened, the market, the conversations, the documentation, meant that Ridgeway had access to the factual version and could draw its own conclusions. Small towns are not always fair, but they are thorough.
It is October now. 1 year since I sat on Cole's kitchen floor and read 11 months of texts and understood the full shape of something I had been half seeing for almost as long. 1 year since I started the Notes app list that became the folder on my laptop, that became the printed excerpts I put on Cole's table at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning when the San Joaquin Valley was doing its best October gold. I am in Sacramento. The lemon tree has produced 11 lemons in the year I have lived here, which I have been counting because counting things is how I mark time, and also because lemons from your own tree taste different from any other kind. I am good at the job. I am building something in this city that is mine in the way that the things you build from the ground up are yours, not given, not inherited, not dependent on anyone else's loyalty or honesty, just made by you from what you had available and what you were willing to put in. Priya is coming for the weekend. My mother is coming for Thanksgiving. My grandmother is trying to figure out the bus schedule for Christmas, and I have told her I will drive to Ridgeway and get her myself, because some things do not need to be negotiated. Jade called last month and we talked for 20 minutes about something other than what happened between us, and it was not entirely natural, but it was honest, and honest is what I am building toward with her, slowly, on my terms, with the clear-eyed patience of a woman who has learned the difference between folding things in and letting them breathe. If you are in the early part of what I was in, I want to tell you some things that I needed to hear at the beginning and did not have. The first is this. When someone consistently defends the people who are harming you, that is not neutrality, and it is not balance. It is a choice about whose reality they are invested in, and the choice tells you everything. The second is jealousy inside a family is real, and it operates in the exact spaces where you are most vulnerable, the spaces where you have lowered your guard because you believe you are safe among people who love you. You are allowed to name it. You are allowed to say, this is what is happening and this is who is doing it, without softening it or qualifying it or folding it in. The third is documentation is not paranoia. Writing down dates and incidents and the specific words people use is not the behavior of a woman who is too sensitive or too intense or reading things into situations that are not there. It is the behavior of a woman who understands that her account of reality is as valid as anyone else's, and that she will need evidence when the person whose behavior she is documenting tells everyone she was just imagining it. The fourth is, leaving is not failure. Leaving is sometimes the most complete form of accountability you can offer. The statement that says, I see the full picture, and the full picture requires me to be somewhere else. And the fifth is the one my grandmother told me, which is the best of all of them. Some people travel lighter by loading others. The job is knowing which things are yours and setting down the ones that are not. You are allowed to set them down. You are allowed to walk away from them. You are allowed to leave them on the table at the farmer's market and drive to Sacramento and drink coffee at a window with a lemon tree and be entirely, actually, genuinely fine. My name is Olivia Reyes, and I was 28 years old when I sat on a kitchen floor in Ridgeway, California, in the October morning light and read 11 months of messages between my boyfriend and my sister, and understood that the story I had been telling myself about my life was not the story that had been happening. I am 29 now, and I am sitting at my kitchen window in Sacramento with coffee and a lemon tree outside doing what it does, which is growing slowly and producing something real with the patient consistency of a thing that has been properly tended. The folder on my laptop is closed. The farmer's market in Ridgeway was 3 Saturdays ago, and I was not there. My mother was there with her produce and her stand, and the particular steady dignity of a woman who has been working the same ground for 30 years and knows exactly what the work is worth. Cole was there with his stone fruit and his heirloom tomatoes and whatever he is building in the year since the full shape of who he was became visible to both of us. Jade is in Fresno, doing the work I told her was hers to do, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that real change always happens. Rita is being Rita.
my grandmother is planning Christmas, and I am here, in this city, in this apartment, at this window with the evidence of a year of clear-eyed decision-making visible in every corner of the life I have built, which is mine, genuinely mine, not performed and not managed and not dependent on anyone's loyalty except my own. That is my story. 1 year, 1 folder, 1 farmer's market, 1 drive north on the highway with the valley going gold in the rearview mirror. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.